Okay, right. So I'm now going to stop sharing and hand you over to David. And as I've said, it's been an enormous privilege to work with David over the years. I've learned an awful lot and I continue to learn. And even in the conversations that we had before when we were sort of talking things through, the mistakes I was making, David was gracious enough, as he always is, to put me right and so on. So I'm going to sort of stop sharing there, and hopefully David will jump in there. That looks like it's working. So David, welcome. Thank you very much, and I'll hand right over to you now.
Thank you very much indeed, Duncan. And I think just for those who may have joined slightly later, to say that at the very beginning, in the light of the sad news about the Queen, we did ask people whether we should go ahead or not. And the feeling was that we should, but the event is being recorded and Helen is sending an email out to everybody who registered just to let them know that the recording will be available, and if people have to leave or can't make it and etc., totally understand. If I crack on with my presentation, as Duncan said, it's what does the data really mean? And the challenge is to make sure that you're doing fair comparisons. Where Duncan and I coming from, it's about genuine school improvement. I'm still involved with schools. I'm still challenged to interpret the data, but it's all about trying to work out what can we do, learn from the data, the questions, answer them, and make things better for the children. However, in the real world, we're also aware that there are external audiences, some of whom may be casting a less than generous eye on the performance of the school. And so it's important to be able to explain your data to an external audience, as well as being able to use it for genuine school improvement. I've just listed here the areas that we're going to cover so that when you get the PowerPoint and recording, you can see roughly where each of the items comes up. But the important thing is for you to know that these slides will be made available for you after the presentation, and there'll be the recording. So it will give you a chance, if you wish, to go back. If there are bits that you're not quite sure about, then you can go back, look at the presentation, look at the slides, and make more sense of it. And also you'll find a number of slides have got tables of figures on there. By making the slides available to you, it means that you're not having to scribble down numbers, it'll all be there. I'm also very aware we've got a range in the audience from people who are new to data through to those who are enormously experienced. And I've tried to make sure that within the presentation, there's an opportunity to explain some of the concepts from scratch, but also to put in some quite thought-provoking aspects. And if you're finding it's going over your head, please don't worry. I've used the image of, you can think of this either as a piece of gristle or a fine wine. It just needs careful chewing and mulling over, but it's worth it in the end with the wine, if not the gristle. So some basic concepts. Duncan's talked about the average and how it's important to get the whole picture. One of the other key themes I keep on talking about is apples and pears. So often, like is being compared with unlike. Apples and pears are absolutely fine. They're both very nice, but you can't compare the two of them in terms of measurements. And so throughout this presentation, in many places, we'll be highlighting where there's a risk of something not being compared on a like-for-like basis. One good example for that is around the non-GCSEs like BTECs and so on, and GCSEs. It's not that is it academic or vocational or easier versus harder, but often the type of grading. GCSEs have fine grading, non-GCSEs tend to have chunkier grading, although I know more gradation has been introduced, but it's a different grading system. And so when you have things like the open bucket in Progress 8, you are mixing the two, and then that can lead to a number of misleading conclusions. So all the time you should be comparing like with like. And then the other really important concept is around relativity. You know, I'm sure you've been sitting in a railway carriage, train next to you, and you suddenly feel that you're moving, and then you realise actually it's the train next to you that's moving and you're still stationary. there's a joke there, which I'm not going to do because Duncan's much better at jokes than I am. But those of us back in 2008 with CVA, your results had slightly improved, but because the rest of the world had suddenly jumped up, yours have got much worse. It's all that sense of relativity, and that is particularly relevant for 2022. As Duncan was saying, most people's results would have gone up. The question is, how much have your results gone up relative to that nationally? And that's what we're going to explore. But that relativity theme is another common one. Some key definitions and measures. I want to begin with the difference between a threshold measure and an average measure. A threshold measure is where pupil has to reach a certain standard, and then you can express that as the percentage of a cohort. For example, the percentage of pupils gaining a grade 4+ in maths. The disadvantage of a threshold measure is that the results for a small range of pupils can affect that particular measure, particularly, for example, those around the 4-3 borderline for the percentage 4+. And also, if you have a multiple threshold, like the original EBAC, where you had to get at least 4 or C in all the pillars, one element can dominate, either in a positive sense because it's all there, or a negative sense, like there for languages where not many people did it. So be very wary of threshold measures, and especially if people start to draw you graphs of an average measure against a threshold measure. That can be really misleading. What about averages? Sounds good. Each pupil gets a score, and then you average the scores across the cohort. For example, the average Key Stage 2 point score on entry or progress 8. However, an average measure can be very significantly affected by an outlier, i.e. an individual where their score is very different from all the others. So, for example, you could have an able pupil in hospital at the time of the exams, and that could be -7 on progress 8, which would outweigh lots of small positives. That becomes an even more acute issue if you're looking at subgroups. And there's a graph there which is looking at a small cluster of children, some SEN ones in red and yellow. Actually, at that school, they're all above the line, apart from one well below it. But if you look at the average, that one below will dominate. And with progress 8, we showed that the outliers, particularly those gaining an attainment of 0, it was a statistically virtually impossible thing to happen. And so we were really delighted that DFE did listen to us. And as I'll show later, they introduced a kind of capping or safety net so that outliers were no longer statistically impossible. Right, let's look at the attainment headlines for June 2022. But importantly, we need to actually go back and understand normal. And in our context, normal means 2019 and previous years, because through comparable outcomes, 2018, 2017, 2016, were all kept broadly similar to 2019. And what we then need to do is place 2022 in the context of the changes that happened in 2020 and 2021 with CAGs and tags. We've had this broad steer from Ofqual that 2022 would be midway approximately between 2019 and 2021. But as Duncan has said, when we look at the detail, we'll find that there's lots of differences to unpick. And importantly, looking ahead, Ofqual have said that 2023 will be back to 2019 in terms of standards and grading. So actually, we need to look backwards in order to look forwards. I put on the screen now the details of all the results for 4 main aspects: all subjects, English language, English literature, and maths. You've got the percentages at each grade, and you've got an average score. Let me just unpick those for a moment. So the average point score, you can see that for all subjects, it had an average point score of 4.83 in 2019. Went up to 5.23 in 2020, up a bit more in 2021, and then came back down in 2022. But the midpoint between 2019 and 2022, I should actually say between 19 and 21. See, we all make mistakes, and I've just spotted my own mistake, was 5.08, whereas actually the Ofqual have awarded us at 5.17, so a little bit more on the generous side, which is helpful. And if we go back we can look at each of those relative to 2019. So 2020 is about 0.4 of a grade on average above 2019. I've also put the percentage getting grade 4 and above. So you can see here for English language, 70% got 4 and above in 2019. It jumped up to 80% in 2020, just a tad more in 2021, and fell back to 77% in 2022. Now the midway point is 75.7. So again, you can see there was that element of generosity from Ofqual, which helped towards the both from the pupil and the school results. Now, it's quite hard looking at that table of figures to get a sense as to what's going on and to get comparison between those four aspects. So let's start to get some graphs. So as we've said, the broad message is results went up and they've now come down, but they're still above 2019. Yes, but actually there's all sorts of nuances and differences, and that's what we want to explore. And Duncan's already picked up how easy it is to accidentally praise or criticize the wrong subject. And you've had people saying, well, the results are clearly better than 2019. Yes, but what about 2023? Now, looking at these graphs here, I've done the 4+ on the left. So we've got all subjects in purple, English language in green, English literature is in blue, and maths is in red. And then over here, we've got the average point score. You'll notice that there is a slight difference in the shape, that the 4+ went up quite dramatically and then steadied, whereas the average point score went up by not quite so much. And then because other grades were involved at that point, went a little bit further before falling back. Now, before I go on to the next slide, could you for a moment just think of all of those 4 subjects, actually, how do is there a sort of subcluster? Are 1 or 2 of them similar to others? How do they group together? Just give you a moment to think about that. And then this shows that a different type of graph going off the baseline makes things much clearer. So we can see here, we're looking now at the difference in the GCSE percentage 4+, or the difference in the average point score compared with 2019. And then it's much clearer to see just how much more English language and all subjects jumped up compared with English literature and maths, which had pretty much the same profile. And that's true whether it's for the percentage 4+ or for the average point score. So a noticeable difference between English language and English literature and maths. And again, there's a risk of making a false judgment around how well English language did relative to maths if you don't take into account the fact that English language went up much more nationally than English literature and maths. Where can we get this data? What further things can we do? Well, Ofqual have got this brilliant analytics site. I've put the URL up the top, and one part of this is called the outcomes. And particular thing that I valued about that is that there's a place where you can download all of the data. So it gives you for all of the subjects from 2008 up to 2022, broken down by gender, etc., etc. So do download it, and then you can play with it to your heart's content. At schools, as soon as people got the results, people can't help but want to do comparisons. It's how do we do compared with last year? How have we done compared with other subjects? How have we done compared with other subjects comparing with how they did last year? And people can get really, you almost can't help but do comparisons and look for differences. But one of the things I want to emphasize throughout this is just how much annual variation is normal, particularly in threshold measures, because we've seen that those threshold measures are particularly sensitive to a few pupils around the threshold. Another of my messages has been we need to be comfortable about normal before we look at 2022. So what I've done here is take the Ofqual variability site for 2017, looked at English language at the percentage 4 plus, and this is looking at the number of centres where the percentage 4 plus went up or went down. That was 2016 to 2017, compared with the previous year, 2015 to 2016, slightly different, but basically we've got a symmetrical distribution. As many went up as down by about the same amount. That's normal, that you normally get from one year to the next. Now, before I go on to the next slide, just have a think, please, because the two slides I'm going to show you are 2019 to 2022. What's that going to show in terms of centre level variation? And 2021 to 2022. What do you think those graphs are going to look like in terms of centre variation? Will we see that everybody has gone up or went down? Just give a moment. And that's the answer. So looking over here, looking at 2021 to 2022, there was a drop. But actually, although most dropped, 75% dropped, a quarter of them moved in the opposite direction. A quarter of them actually went up. Just to explain what these bars mean, there's a bar here that's between minus 0.75% and minus 10%. What it means is that about 350 centres, their percentage 4 plus in English language went down by between 7.5 and 10%. So that's 2021 to 2022. What about 2019 to 2022? Well, that should go up. And it does for most people, but only 75%. There are another quarter who've moved in the opposite direction. Is that a surprise? Well, just look at the mean is about 6 percentage points upwards. This one is 6 percentage points downwards. But remember, I was talking about a variation of 10% is either way is okay. So actually, it's not surprising that you've got a quarter or so moving in the opposite direction. Variability is much greater than people give it credit for. Now for Attainment 8 and Progress 8, as Duncan said, these were introduced in 2016, plenty of notice, and the fundamentals have stayed the same ever since, which has been really helpful. But it was last used formally in 2019, so I'm going to do a quick run through, plus make some subtle points for those who are perhaps more experienced, because it's really important to understand the situation as it was in order to correctly interpret the current situation. So this is how Progress 8 works. You take all the pupils nationally for a given Key Stage 2 entry point, calculate the average, which is the red dot here. You then take the individual pupil, look at the difference, divide by 10, because there are 10 parts in Progress 8, and that gives you their Progress 8 score, and you average it across the whole school. And the important thing is that the national average is calculated for each prior attainment, so it's inherently fair to pupils right across the ability range, whether you're right down here or right up there. It's inherently fair. Why do you divide by 10? Well, remember that English and maths are double weighted. You've got the 3 slots in EBAC, the 3 slots in open, but English and maths are double weighted, which is why it comes up to 10 and why you divide by 10. And this again is the counterintuitive part. You see this red line? If this red line goes upwards, the green arrow actually becomes shorter, i.e. the Progress 8 becomes smaller. And people can really struggle with the opposite movement. So say if the National Attainment 8 goes up, schools Progress 8 will go down. It goes in the opposite direction. And this is to look now at how it goes at a school level. Each of these dots represents a pupil within a school. The Key Stage 2 schools across the bottom. Each of the dots is a pupil, and the dotted line is the national average for each of these Key Stage 2 prior starting points. I put a couple of either maximum ones, which is the purple one here at a ceiling, because the ceiling is now 90. You can have 10 lots of grade 9, or at the other end, there's a floor here because you've got 0, but you can't get less than 0. How does that look when we convert it over to a progress 8? Well, you can see that this ceiling line has, the whole thing is tilted, because what you're trying to do is to make the national average horizontal. The national average line here becomes your 0 progress 8. And what we're doing here is that line has tilted, and then equally the floor line here, that's also tilted. It's not quite a straight line because that's curved, so it gets curved when you tilt it onto its side. But that's the connection between progress 8 and attainment 8. And what was really good was that Ofsted did agree that this could be used during that period in September, as Duncan said. But we're now going to look at some school level measures against Key Stage 2 average point score. All of this is public domain information. I've put the URL there, and we're looking at just over 3,000 mainstream secondary schools from the 2019 tables, which is the last available information. What I've done here, each dot is a school, and across the bottom is their average Key Stage 2 score. Up the side is their attainment 8 score. And you can see that there's a very strong link between the prior attainment and the attainment 8. So if you're a school that's got a high prior attainment of students, you're likely to score highly. If you've got a school with low prior attainment, then your attainment 8 score is going to be lower. And this is why the raw attainment measures were so unfair on schools, that period leading up to 2016. If you were teaching in the school with low prior attainment, you were really into a difficult situation as far as the external judgment is concerned. That's why it was so important to get progress 8 through. You'll see there's a small number up here of mainly, but not all selective. Not all of those are grammar schools. Some of those are comprehensive, and equally you've got some grammar schools down in here. But yeah, broadly speaking, those are selective. Strong correlation here. Now, what happens when we do the difference between these and the national line? And that gives us progress 8. Could you just not look on the right hand side for a moment? Just look at this whole area here, and we've got the very strong 0 line going across. And what we can see is that whether you've got a low prior attainment or a middle prior attainment or an above average prior attainment, it's pretty much as many above as below. So finally, if you were in school with low prior attainment, you're in with a decent chance of being above the line as you are below the line. It's so much fairer than it was previously. And you can see mathematically that there's only a small correlation, which is mainly driven by these up here, which are the mainly selective schools. And before you jump, think it's something with progress 8, Mike Treadaway, whom Duncan mentioned, did a session on it saying that for almost any kind of value added measure, the researchers find that schools with very high prior attainment tend to be scoring more highly on value added. There's a lot of argument as to the reasons. Is it around the teachers that you can get, or the issues that go with that funding, whatever, but that's nothing to do with progress 8 itself. It's a general value added consequence. Now let's look at the actual attainment 8 figures mapped across by prior attainment. This is when it was first came out in 2016, and you can see the purple line, which is the EBAC one, and the red one, which is the average attainment 8. The top one is the other bucket, and the brown one is English. So quite spread out there. But a year later, the purple one had moved up a bit. There's a bit of strange movement from English, but that's to do with the grading change that Duncan was talking about. But you've got a shape there, so do remember that shape, because we're going to be coming back to that later to see what it is currently. But as I said, it's important that you know what it used to be in order to know what it might be back again in 2023. Now this explains what's happened to EBAC. what we're looking at here is the EBAC slot and the other slot. There are 3 slots in the bucket. And one of the first things is how many of the slots are filled, because if a child is only doing 2 subjects in the EBAC bucket, the third one counts as 0 because it takes the average of that. So if you're not filling it, you're not in with a chance. What was interesting, 2015 was the last year before Progress 8, but everybody knew what was happening, so they'd had a chance to change their curriculum. And even by 2016, there'd been a movement upwards. And then on the right-hand side, we carry on upwards, further increases, and that's where it got to by 2018. Now, let's look at what it's going to be like for 2022. Firstly, where do you get the information? Well, I've given you the link down the bottom. If you go to that URL, then these are the documents that are available. And I'd like to highlight to you that the main guide is actually dated February 2020. If you've got something around, you think, oh, there must be a more up-to-date one. No, the basics remain the same. What did happen was in March 2022, there was an update specifically for the 2022 measures, which we'll look at in a moment. But the main description is in this document from February 2020. So this is what you'll find in that February 2020, a list of all the scores from the previous year so that people know how it was. And you'll also notice all of these input measures. The Key Stage 2 score was rounded to the nearest decimal point. If you add that all up, you'll find that there are 34 input measures, including a couple at the bottom for those students where perhaps they didn't take the Key Stage test, they were working towards it, etc. So there's an input group at the bottom which had a score of 1.5 that was a notional score. So 34 input groups. Now, how about the output? As I said, the basic definition is the same. The main issue was how to treat early entries. And all of that's covered in the update, essentially to get the English bucket, it counts as an entry, but not the grade itself. So you can at least do the doubling up if you did an early entry, but the details are all here. What about the input? Well, as Duncan said, when it was last calculated, Key Stage 2 was expressed in fine scores and so on. Key Stage 2 results in 2016 were scale scores, and so we were expecting 2021, year 11, it was going to be calculated in terms of those scores. And we're starting to look ahead in doing it. But in fact, it never happened, as we know. And so this is going to be the first year when the input is measured using scale scores. It also affects the prior attainment bands and transition matrices. And what's been really encouraging is that the DFE team have consulted on how best to implement it. It's not straightforward, the various judgments are made, but we are appreciative of the team consulting. And now I've put a little reminder to myself saying drum roll. You know, when you're doing an assembly, you might want to have a big announcement and get everyone to do a drum roll. I'm not asking you to bang on your monitor screens, particularly as we've switched the microphones off. But if you can imagine a massive drum roll, because this is what you've all been waiting for, it's what is the CISR and SMID estimate of the attainment 8 for 2022 using the latest prior attainment groups. And the answer is, ta-da! Actually, it's a bit of an anticlimax because it's just a red line on the graph. But that's the key information that we need at this point to be able to estimate what the Progress 8 score is going to be of our schools, and indeed get ready for Ofsted if I'll take that as it comes through. Please remember that there is a health warning from the DFE about exactly how it's calculated, which I'll come on to in a moment. But we've done some calculations, we've checked it out with schools, and it seems to make sense. So we'll see, we'll find out the last week of September just how accurate it was. We can both be hiding under the duvet, but we're feeling reasonably confident at the moment. And those are the numbers that go behind it. I've left them there so that when you get the slides, if you do want to, then you can see. And over on the right-hand side, I've divided by the size of the bucket so that we can do the comparisons in the graphs. Remember, we did this exercise for 2016, 2017. On the right is the situation for 2022. And you can see that the lines have got ever closer together. English has crept up a bit. Open is there. Everything has got closer. Notice how that purple one, the EBAC, it's overtaken maths. It's getting really quite close. What's going on there? Has performance improved within the EBAC subjects, or is there something else? Well, actually it was something else, because it's all to do with the number of slots filled. On the left, you've got the situation as it was in 2016 to 2018. On the right, you've got the situation for 2022. And look at that. The EBAC slots is virtually the same as the open slots. So it means across the country, pretty much all of the pupils have got all of their EBAC and open slots filled. Now, in terms of changing the curriculum experience of pupils, that's been a massive change since 2016, all through the incentivisation caused by Progress 8. It wasn't a diktat telling schools that you had to change your curriculum. Schools were incentivised by this progress measure, and then it's used by Ofsted and on tables, etc., etc. But we've fundamentally changed the curriculum experience of pupils, in as much as I say, pretty much every pupil now is doing 3 EBAC subjects, probably 2 sciences and history or geography, as we'll see later. Now, this is a pupil level attainment 8 and progress 8. I've taken a sample of schools and created a sample that's got an overall progress 8 score of 0, and there are 4,000 dots there. And the idea of doing this was to give you a sense as to, for your school, what might be typical against, sorry, how is it looking against a typical set of pupils. And I've done the same as I've done previously by putting 1 at the top and 1 down with 0. And you can see over here where they are. And I've done as before. I've taken the ceiling and I've taken the floor and moved those over, both the ceiling at the top and the floor at the bottom. Now, that ceiling is important because sometimes you may get governors or parents saying, oh, you're not pushing the most able, you're not getting them up there. Well, they can't, because you've got a maximum of 90. You cannot get up into that area. Similarly, why have you got more down here than here? Well, again, because there was a floor, you can't get less than 0. But I think, as I said, what has been helpful is the DfE have now introduced a safety net. This is statistically calculated so that here is statistically plausible, here is statistically implausible. So these dots will get moved up to that safety net, and then it means that that's statistically plausible within that area. Those are the key points, which I think I've just talked through. So let's move on. We're of time. Now, remember the graph on the bottom left that was linking attainment 8 with Key Stage 2, and we had that strong linkage, and then the selective schools up the top. Again, using some of the collaboration data, I've created, I'm calling it an oval of, and this is looking at the main schools. We're not taking account of the ones at the end. I think that most schools will fall within that oval. And if you've got a positive progress 8, you're likely to be in the upper half. If you've got a negative progress 8, you're likely to be in the lower half. But you may find this quite helpful just to plot where your school is, just to give colleagues, governors a sense as to the context within which you're operating. There isn't a direct relationship because of the way that the averaging takes place, but we'd be interested in feedback as to, does that seem plausible? Are most schools falling within that oval shape? Now, well, you look at that and it looks like spaghetti junction. What I'm doing here is taking the difference from 2019 to 2020 for the EBAC subjects and doing it by Key Stage 2 prior attainment. So let's take computing, for example. What this is showing is that right across the prior attainment range, the computing average grade in 2020 was a whole grade higher than it had been in 2019. It drops off a bit at the end again because you've got a little bit of a ceiling of the grade 9s. On the other hand, you've got English literature, which particularly for middle attaining pupils, they only went up by 0.2, 0.25 of a grade from 2019 to 2020. The more able ones went up higher. And this dark black line with the red dots, that represents the overall average. And you can see that it's about 0.4, that increase from 2019 to 2020. And I've labelled the other subjects in there like history and geography or the separate sciences so that you can get a sense as to just how much it was different from one subject to another and how you need to take that into account when you're doing your subject comparisons. And that's why the transition matrix exercise is so important, because once we get that information, then you can genuinely see how your subject compares with the national information. So I've picked out the EBAC subjects on that slide, and then the next one is all subjects, and that looks really tangled, but that was why I wanted to pick out the EBAC ones first. I've left computing at the top, English literature is here, all down the middle, and then the other higher ones labelled music, again, was one that had quite high, particularly at the top end actually, drama, PE, etc. Let's look at the Key Stage 2 scores now. Key Stage 2 test takes a fundamentally different approach from GCSE and A Level. GCSE and A Level use comparable outcomes, so the grades pretty much stay the same over time. That change came in 2010. There'd been an increase up to then. Now, on the other hand, Key Stage 2 tries to maintain an absolute standard. They tried to set questions and try to do it with people looking at the papers to try and get an absolute standard. But as Ofqual have made it clear, there's what's called the sawtooth effect. As soon as you get a new testing regime, people aren't sure what it's going to look like. Pupils aren't sure. And so things drop. So on that graph, what they've labelled as year 6 will be 2016. Things came in, the results were low. Well, it was a surprise to everybody. Nobody should have been surprised that it was lower. And then again, it all starts to pick up because people have seen the questions, they know what's going to come, they prepare the pupils. It's nothing to do with overall standards, it's just familiarity with the testing regime. But it does mean that you've got to be very careful when looking at Key Stage 2 because of that variation from year to year in a way that in normal years isn't the case with GCSE and A Level because they've got comparable outcomes. And remember, any value-added measure like Progress 8 depends as much on the input as the output. If your input changes, then the value changes. So these are cumulative graphs that I'm going to show you just to give you a sense as to the variation that's floating around. Let's look back at 2017 because those were the Key Stage 2 tests that were taken by the Year 11s who've just taken their GCSEs. We've got the scaled scores across the bottom. I've made some lines across for comparators with the old level 4s and levels 5 and so on. What again I think is a missed opportunity is that there isn't a consistency between maths, reading and the grammar scores. They are different. So when you're looking at your pupils' results, you'll probably find if you've got more able pupils that their maths is is going to be different from the reading and vice versa. It's a shame because it makes it quite difficult to understand what's going on. 2016 you can see was lower, and that's clearer if I put it here. We can see that you've got if we take a particular fixed score like 100 in 2016, you had to get to the percentage. There's a significant difference you can see between 2016 and 2017. Now let's look at the prior attainment. This is going into detail, and obviously if you're into statistics, if you're into data, you need to know where to go if there's a particular question. And I've put the link here. Again, it's not necessarily obvious, but well worth a read. If somebody asks you a specific question, or you want to know about free school meals, how's that count or whatever, go here. And we want to look at it for prior attainment, because this is where it tells you exactly what happens. Firstly, it's that decision that they're going to use the English reading and the maths. They're not using the grammar score. And then with the prior attainment categories, it's defined in terms of 100 and 110, which is in a sense not a surprise, given that those have got a wider currency, 100 being the expected, 110 being the higher one. What that does mean, though, is that there's a radical change in the percentages in the low, middle and high prior attainment bands. Under old regime, it was quite low in lower and quite high in the high. But for the students in 2021, there was actually 32% of pupils were categorised as low prior attainment. Now remember that the 2017, which is the one that we're going to be interested, the results got better. So this percentage will be lower. But again, until the DfE actually publish it, we don't know what that result is going to be. Few other detailed points there to 1 decimal point. If a score is missing, the average score is deemed to be just the one result, and there are special sets of scores for pupils who are on the P scale, below the standard, etc. And they're all likely to go into a prior attainment group, group 1. How have they been defined? Well, this is what you'll find tucked away in the tables checking website in the format guide. There is actually this table. It's got a big health warning from DfE that it is provisional, they'll give an update, but this is it. And you can see that by and large, I think the scores get rounded. 103.5 and 104 count as a single prior attainment group. It's just at the beginning that things are spread out a bit in order to get more students into each of these groups. And there's this special group 1 for the students who come into the things like the P scales, etc. It's not a large group, but it is there. Fine, we've got last few minutes. Tables checking exercise, just to highlight to you that there are 2 files and you need to bring the 2 of them together, and then look out for it in the end of September, October. Published data for 2019. This is draw attention to that the SEN Progress 8 figure is minus 0.44, probably about the same again, and SEN minus 0.6, because on any other tables, you won't see those figures. So I just wanted to put them in there to give you a heads up. Subject transition matrices, I'll skip through very quickly because Duncan has already described how that operates. I put the links in to how it used to be back in 2019 when everything was very clear. Fortunately, they did continue to publish these in 2020 and 2021, but it had to be sort of below the radar a bit. So they're tucked away within download all data at this website here. All the information is there for you to go and look at. Just to highlight, the Office of Statistics Regulator did conduct a review, gave a positive verdict, and really hearteningly, transition matrices were mentioned by a good number of respondents, which I think helps to keep a high profile for them and keep them continued. What's going to happen 2022? Duncan's covered these changes. When's the data available? Listed that there for you. And can I just finish with severe grading? It's been an issue. After many years of campaigning, 15 years of campaigning, Ofqual did make a small change to make French and German in line with Spanish. It does mean that there are thousands of students who will get a better grade, but it's nowhere near what history would be. You can see the difference that will be there. So we're still campaigning to get it near history and geography. A level, similar issue here of the average point score being between 2019, which is the blue diamond, and 2021, which is the red square, but there's quite a big difference, and I've ranked these. So mathematics was the one with the least difference, right up to music, which had a big difference. And it was the same in the percentage, music jumping from 20% up to nearly 60%, whereas maths just had a small change there. Shows how careful you've got to be comparing one subject with another. And finally, as we move towards the end, and we're heading towards 8:30, so timing is looking good, pass over back to Duncan to introduce SMID and CISRA.
David, thank you very much. As I have never failed to learn every time I've heard you speak, and I know colleagues who've been in this session will absolutely agree. So I've explained to you earlier, we're very, very grateful to both SMID and CISRA for their support and letting us bring this event to you free of charge. But even more so for the incredibly gracious way that they've worked with David in particular, but David and I to explore the things that we have, and for the confidence that we are able to do so. So I've asked both SMID and CISRA to give you a quick slide showing what you can do. I'm not making any comments about systems, and there are other systems, but many of you will be SMID users already, and know the benefits. SMID do host the transition matrix toolkit that we'll talk to you about in just a moment, because there's no such thing as a free webinar. I'm going to ask you to do something in a moment. So let's have CISRA's slide, please, David. So that's the same information from CISRA. I noticed some of you are asking questions. So Dom and Steve from SMID. Hello, Steve. Another formidable warrior in the cause to get data being used better as well. I noticed they're responding to questions in the chat, so that's absolutely great. But if you're interested in contacting CISRA, from what we've said, that's how you can do it. So massive thanks to both these amazing organisations for their support. So I think we're there. Can we just move on to the final slide, David? And then are you okay with questions? If people, obviously people, because of this evening, are welcome to do what you need to do, obviously. But we have an evaluation form. I'm hoping that's also, the link is going to magically appear in the chat by our very gracious technical help, Helen. Oh, look at that, as if by magic. Fantastic, thank you. So there's a form there. So clearly, we've not done this in this format before. If this was helpful, useful, not so, we would really like to know. And then there's an opportunity in there to say, if you would like something like this again, would you like a sort of an entry-level version of this? Would you like a version of this or something different in your own setting, or support for your own school, your own trust, or whatever it is? Then feel free to do so. I gave you my Twitter handle if you want to connect. Some of you have already. That's great. I think I've followed you all back. If you want to get in touch with me directly, that's my email address. You're very welcome to get in touch directly. And as David says, we'll share both the presentation and give you that link in the follow-up email. So your call to action then is that we think that in order to sort of satisfy the apples and pears and the Mona Lisa principle, if you like, that the transition matrix way of looking at performance is the way to go. And David's toolkit is superb. So SMID have kindly, hopefully still continuing to make that available free. And what we'd like you to do, you and your friends, talk to all your data friends about this. When your tables checking files come out, take part in the sort of the collaboration to upload that data, and you'll be able to use that that transition matrix toolkit free of charge, and get the right answer, to be able to look fairly at how your subjects have performed, and then to get that sort of insight. And kudos to David for his brilliant idea, and I'm so pleased that that's going to be available to everybody. Okay, there are some questions in the chat, David. I'll raise some. Some are specific to colleagues at SMID and CISRA. Can I ask you one of my own? Is that all right?
I've stopped sharing now so that we can start to...
So,
sorry, Duncan, should I actually, given it's 8:30,
yeah,
can we perhaps say to people that this is the end of the
sure, yeah,
presentation itself, and obviously people can slip off, but perhaps also if Helen wishes to allow people to put their video and sound on, and just really do a big thank you to Dom and Steve and everybody else for coming along, and appreciate the complexity of the evening. And we'll stop the recording now, so please feel free to slip off, but we'll stay on and take any questions from anybody who wants to, for as long as anybody wishes to.
That's great. So there's a question about Key Stage 2